In this video, I'm going to break down how to make your podcast the only options your listeners buy from. That works even with a small audience. So here's a 5-part framework that you can start using literally today if you're looking to generate more money from your podcast. This exact same process our client Sheridan used to monetize her show. So look, my name is Anthony Winery. I'm the co-founder of GetMoreListeners.com, a company helping education-based podcasters, business owners, coaches, experts in their fields turn a slow growth show into a rapidly growing positive ROI show. Over the last 4 years, I've interviewed and coached 350 plus podcasters, and I'm also the co-host of Why Your Podcast Isn't Growing, which generates $10,000 of attributed sales each month. So Sheridan literally was able to turn more listeners into clients and added $12,000 to a podcast within 30 days, even with a tiny audience. And in this context, a tiny audience simply means she was getting around 800 downloads per month, which isn't bad, right? A podcast getting 800 downloads per month, $12,000 in profit, not bad at all in 30 days. I want to make something very clear. This case study is not going to be one that's focused on how to get more listeners for your podcast. I've got tons out there already on my channel. This is really going to focus in on how to position and package your show in a way that attracts, engages, and converts listeners into clients and customers. So these are two very different things. Because look, let's face it, I've had podcasts and spoke to podcasters that get 10,000 monthly downloads, but they haven't monetized their show. They're barely making any money and they don't know how to monetize or turn their listeners into actual customers because they aren't positioned in the right way. So what do I mean? Essentially means that they're attracting the wrong listeners who just won't buy, who aren't their ideal clients or customers. There's a disconnect there, but I'm going to talk more about this in just a little bit. So again, we're going to focus more on the position and packaging over just like growing the podcast just to grow it. We're trying to optimize for converting listeners into clients. So this case study will be split up into 2 parts. I want to just set the frame straight up. The first part is going to be the positioning. So there's the internal state of the podcast, what the podcast offers, what is the offer of the podcast. So what the podcast does, who it's for, what it promises, and there's going to be a few more that I'll break down in just a moment. Then the second piece is the packaging. This is more so the external state of the show. So the presentation, the exterior, this is your show name, your episode titles, format, description, keywords you want to target. Essentially how it presents in the podcast in a way to attract the listeners you want to reach. So again, 2 parts we're going to split up into positioning and packaging. So here's an example of what I mean to really clarify the difference between position and packaging to make it crystal clear. Imagine you have a restaurant, right? So imagine your podcast is like a restaurant. To make your restaurant successful, you need to focus on the 2 main aspects. In essence, what your restaurant offers, positioning, and the presentation of how you're offering things, publicly. So how you attract people in. Packaging. When it comes to the positioning, there's the heart of the restaurant, right? So the positioning is essentially the concept or the identity of your restaurant. So this includes the menu, what the podcast does in that reference, right? What types of food you serve. Is it Italian? Is it Japanese? Is it vegan? Is it fusion, right? Who's your target audience? So what type of customers are you wanting to attract? Are you aiming for foodies, families, dining, fine dining enthusiasts or health conscious individuals? Again, who you're targeting. This is all about the positioning. Then, of course, we also have, the dining experience, what you promise, what is the atmosphere like? What is the experience you're promising to your customers? Is it cozy, intimate? Is it high energy? Or is it more luxury? Or is it more luxurious and fine dining experience? Again, this is about your positioning. How are you positioning your restaurant to attract the right people? Again, so this reflects for a podcast. This is kind of the reflection of the unique value proposition of the show. What it promises to its listeners. It could be entertainment, education, inspiration, or something else. But again, I'm going to really give you practical examples of Sheridan's show in just a moment. So then we have the packaging, right? So the packaging is the presentation of the actual restaurant. This exterior stuff, the marketing, how we're attracting people coming in. We know who it's for. We know the positioning. Great. How are we going to package this to attract the right people? So this includes the restaurant name, so is it something catchy, memorable, how it's designed? Is it the actual menu itself? This could be episode titles, how you name and describe the dishes on the menu. Is it clear, enticing? How you describe the food that people want to try? So again, this is like having compelling episode titles to draw people in. Then you have the exterior stuff, you have the actual restaurant layout. So the internal design, the layout of the restaurant, which affects, again, dining experience. A well thought out format for a podcast ensures a good listener experience, right? Then you have, of course, the marketing, advertising, the keywords, how you marketing on the front end when you're promoting on social media, when you're doing all this stuff when it comes to, maybe SEO. All these pieces, again, plays a role within the packaging of the show. There's the external stuff, how you attracting people in. So why you need both? So just as a restaurant needs great food and an inviting presentation to succeed, your podcast needs a strong positioning and effective packaging. Without a clear and compelling concept positioning, people just won't understand what your podcast is about, who it's for, why they should care, why they should listen. It doesn't matter. And if you can't get them to listen, you're not going to get them to buy anything from you. That's so important. And without an attractive or strategic presentation, your packaging, even the best podcasts in the world just go unnoticed. If you're struggling to grow right now, maybe you have an incredible podcast, maybe you've got incredible content, but if you're not packaging it the right way, you're not going to attract the listeners you want to reach, even if you have an amazing podcast. So again, we have to focus on these elements. So you need both. You need both. You need both in order to not only deliver valuable content, but to also attract and retain the listeners you want to reach. So now let's look at the positioning when it comes to the actual podcast itself. Number one, define your targeting. Zero in on who your podcast is for and the specific problem you solve. Everyone talks about this. I know you've heard it 1,000 times. Just bear with me. I promise. Just bear with me, okay? And this is really important. Like most people skip over it, or most people think that they're targeted, but they're really not. Number two, promise a transformation. You need to give a promise of what your audience are going to get when they listen to your show. What's the transformation? We have a podcast called Why Your Podcast Isn't Growing. The transformation is you get clarity around why your podcast isn't growing to turn a slow growth show into a rapidly growing positive ROI show in 6 months. That's a clear promise, right? Go from slow and steady growth to fast growing show. That's transformation. What's your transformation? Clearly state the outcome listeners can expect by tuning into your show. Number two, pinpoint their pain point. The listeners you want to attract, what's their pain point, right? What's keeping them up at night? What are they worried about? What are the challenges that they're going through? Number four, the unique mechanism. So distinguish your podcast with a unique approach or solution that sets you apart from the rest. What makes you different? If you're trying to turn listeners into clients, having a unique mechanism allows you to stand out, allows you to feel like a one-of-a-kind show that I've just discovered. For example, our podcast, we really focus in on certain principles when it comes to building our USP, when it comes to focusing in on a demand-based content strategy, which is a unique approach of deciding what topics to pick on your show. We really focus on retaining listeners over just getting exposure on a podcast. These are certain unique, and we also obsess over podcast SEO. So for you, what are some unique mechanisms? So if someone comes in, what are they going to notice about your show that feels a bit different? What are you doing that's really different? Again, I'm going to give you practical examples of what this looks like in just a moment. Then 5, creating a demand-based content strategy. So each episode should be a stepping stone towards solving a piece of a bigger puzzle, meaning each episode is helping your clients, helping your listeners solve a specific problem that they're going through this transformation, right? And again, I'm going to give you an example in just a moment. So quick recap: 1, define your target audience. 2, promise a transformation. 3, pinpoint their pain points. 4, find and develop a unique mechanism. 5, creating a demand-based content strategy. This is what your podcast needs to embody and deliver for your listeners. So where do most people go wrong? So you have a podcast that's misaligned with the clients you want to attract. If it's misaligned, you're not going to attract them. Number 2, you think you need to have a massive audience in order to monetize. You're probably thinking about sponsorships or all these deals and malakis, but that doesn't really work. You don't need a massive audience. Number 3, you think it's going to be some kind of magical call to action that makes you money. But here's the thing: if no one finds or discovers your podcast, and if you're not reaching the right listeners, it doesn't matter how magical the call to action is and how effective it is. People won't take action, they just won't, because again, it's misaligned. Finally, you don't have an effective content strategy to attract, nurture, and convert listeners into clients. This is a big sticking point. Most people just don't have an actual content strategy in place, a process of picking specific topics they cover on the show in order to attract, nurture, and convert listeners. You might have guests on your podcast, but it doesn't mean you're attracting the right listeners tuning in who are going to become clients. So you have to be very intentional. You might speak to clients, you might speak to communities and have ideas in your mind, but you have to have a content strategy in place that you feel confident is actually doing the nurturing for you. So here's a case study that breaks down exactly what this looks like in terms of practically speaking. And this is one of our one-on-one clients called Sheridan. So Sheridan's podcast focus. Sheridan's podcast was aimed for female entrepreneurs, specifically tackles the challenge of building a profitable, sustainable, and more importantly, anxiety-free business. So our show stands out because it's not just addressing entrepreneurial challenges, but it focuses on the unique intersection between healing trauma and business success. Pretty damn unique. Number 2, when it comes to targeting and pain point identification. So her target audience is female entrepreneurs grappling with anxiety and its impact on their business. Their pain point: they struggle with anxiety that hinders their ability to grow a sustainable and profitable business. Sheridan identifies her niche, which is business owners, right? But she then looks what's a widespread issue amongst her target audience. She then positions her podcast by addressing the market gap. There's so many podcasts out there about business, but very few podcasts are focusing on the mental health aspects of entrepreneurship. Number 3, promise transformation. So Sheridan's podcast promises listeners actionable strategies to heal trauma and to regulate their nervous system, which lays the groundwork for a business free of constraints of anxiety. So again, you see how everything is tied in. It's not just like a business podcast. No, there's intentionality behind it. She has specific targeting. She knows exactly what she's promising. This is what you need to be doing with your podcast and needs to be clear as day. Number 4, unique mechanism. So what Sheridan's podcast does that sets her apart, right, is her focus on healing trauma and regulating the nervous system. This is her way of helping her clients solve their problem, to solve their pain points, right? This unique mechanism distinguishes her podcast from other generic shows out there, right? It offers a totally different and fresh perspective to entrepreneurial growth. What are you going to offer your listeners as a fresh perspective to what they want to reach? If it's about personal development, what's your fresh perspective? If it's about, if your business is about habits, how are you going to present that in a new, unique way? If your business is about podcasting, how are you going to package that in a unique, different way? I know we have our own unique mechanism. And for Sheridan, she had a business podcast, but again, she had her own unique mechanism that she focused in on to help her clients get the results, right? So this isn't a classic, overdone, I'll say it again, overdone business interview podcast. It's totally different. And then finally, the actual application of this framework. So for Sheridan, we really focused in on her content, right? Each episode that we created was designed to address a specific pain points her audience were facing. We then incorporated interviews, personal antidotes, scientific backed data and techniques to manage anxiety and entrepreneurship. Her content was positioned as a solution to her listeners' problems. This is the missing link for most people. They just create content, interview amazing guests, but there's no intention. You have no intention of how this is actually going to turn this stranger into a listener, get them coming back for more, nurture them, and then get them to buy your stuff, right? But when you have all these pieces in place that we just spoke about, right? When you have a defined target audience, you give a very specific promise when it comes to transformation. You've pinpointed their pain points you have a unique mechanism, and you have created a demand-based content strategy that helps them solve their specific problems with each episode. It becomes far more easier for you to grow, for you to monetize, for you to attract the right people. So the monetization strategy, leveraging her podcast's unique position, she introduces very specific coaching services designed to help her listeners overcome anxiety and thrive in their business. So she has a coaching business that literally helps them do this exact same thing. And the alignment is there. There's no separation between her business and her customers and clients in real life and her podcast. Her podcast is the front-facing asset for her business. This is how you convert a podcast from an expensive time suck into a positive ROI show, even with a small audience. So this direct line between her podcast content and her actual paid offering makes monetization seamless and natural. She's not trying to convince people of her mechanism, of her strategies, why they work. Her podcast is already doing that. So when they show up on the call, they're literally saying, hey, take my money. Like, literally just take my money. Like, right now, take my money. I already paid you, you know? That's what you want, right? When you do this properly, that's what the experience should be. Because using a podcast as a lead gen tool is phenomenal, Michael. You know, like it is so good. And the quality of leads that you get and prospects that show up on a call, they're ready to buy because you've done the hard work. If you've done the hard work up front and taken these steps are broken down. So look at the positioning. Now here's the second part, which is the packaging, right? This is the external state, the presentation, how we communicate the value of the show to attract the listeners we want to attract and reach. So for her, when it comes to her show name and cover art, her show name, embodied entrepreneur, financial freedom, anxiety free with nervous system and trauma healing. Again, we know exactly who the podcast is for. We know what the podcast is about. We know what the desired outcome is, financial freedom, anxiety free, and we know how she's going to do it. Nervous system and trauma healing. Guess who's going to listen to her podcast when they see this? Guess who's going to be attracted to her show? Female entrepreneurs, most likely, looking at based on the cover. We haven't explicitly stated it in the title, right? But based on the cover, female entrepreneurs who want financial freedom, but they want to do it without anxiety free. How do they want to do it? Through the unique mechanism, by focusing on their central nervous system and trauma healing. That's the only people who would ever think about listening to the show because, again, we've packaged it in the right way. When it comes to her episode title, the alignment's there again. Read these titles. 2 skills smart entrepreneurs must master for financial freedom without burnout. Central nervous system training. You see, again, who's going to be attracted to this? Again, when we look at, you're supposed to be overwhelmed. The unpopular truth about financial freedom, capacity, somatic, and healing trauma and nervous system. Again, guess who's going to be attracted to these episodes? Because she's packaged them in the right way. Because she's packaged the podcast in the right way to be in alignment with her actual business. right? And then finally, we have how to pick money. Again, I could go in all day. You could probably do this on your own. But the point is, these titles are clear, intriguing, and speaks directly to her listeners' pain points. So we're talking about her pain points, and then we're communicating who the show is for to attract the listeners we want to reach, right? Then we have the show's format, right? She mainly does solo with some interviews. For her, she positions herself as the authority. When she has a solo show, the attention is all about her. She's able to have that consistency, able to build that connection with her audience, able to vibe her, feel her, understand her a lot more with a solo show. And that's the difference. Again, and for you, experiment with different formats that actually will match your audience needs, their consumption habits, what they like, what they don't like. We have the show description. If you read this description, who's it speaking to? Specifically who she wants to reach. There's no fluff, there's no nothing. It's just specifically who she wants to reach. And then we add listen to a fan favorite episode, right? And then finally the keywords, right? So we show you high traffic keywords. This is all about podcast SEO, her being found organically by her ranking her podcast for relevant keywords on Apple and Spotify. Apple and Spotify are the main platforms new listeners go to when discovering a new show. They search in specific keywords: nervous system, anxiety-free business, financial freedom. And because she's ranking for that keyword, she's now being found organically by her ideal listeners. And only her ideal listeners would ever click on a podcast that's titled Embodied Entrepreneur, Financial Freedom, Anxiety-Free with nervous system and trauma healing. My point is, everything is succinct. We're not guessing, we're being intentional, right? And this is what she says. She posted this within our community. She says, hey, this process is working. I've been using SEO and the social media strategy, and I've had clients come in. And guess what? She had clients coming in, and they purchased her body-based embodied entrepreneur, body-based business coaching. That's her program, right? So this really does work when you have all these things in place. So what are the results? Within just 30 days of implementing this targeted content strategy, Sheridan was able to generate $12,000, proving the effectiveness of aligning your podcast content with a specific listener needs and having a unique solution to offer them. You have to position the podcast in the right way. You have to package the podcast in the right way. Her success shows that you too can monetize your podcast even with a small audience if you have the right strategy in place. And this is why we obsess over content strategy, over positioning, over the packaging, the foundational pieces. Everyone's so obsessed. Everyone is so obsessed with getting exposure on their show. But it doesn't matter if you get exposure on a podcast that can't turn eyeballs into listeners, that can't keep listeners coming back for more, and that can't nurture those listeners, turning them into clients. It's just not going to work. If you've been struggling, it's because you're missing these pieces. So look, if you want to grow fast, get big, and monetize as soon as possible, you have to have this alignment. I want to encourage you to focus on creating content that promises and delivers a transformation related to that pain point of your audience, to differentiate your podcast with a unique mechanism or approach to solving the problem, to align your monetization strategies with your audience's specific needs and desires, and to package your show in a way to communicate the value of the podcast in order to attract the listeners you want to reach. It's really that simple. This focused approach positions your podcast in growth and opens a direct path to monetization by offering a high-value solution to your audience's most painful problems. This is how you position your podcast as the only option your listeners want to buy from. So look, my name is Anthony Muneri. You have been absolutely awesome. I've had so much fun actually creating this video. And I think it's really important to differentiate between just growing, but actually positioning your podcast to attract the people you want to reach. It is really, really important. If you're struggling right now with slow and steady growth in your business owner, you're spending tons of money and you feel like your podcast is burning a bunch of cash and you want to start seeing more of a return on investment, you have to have these things in place. And honestly, these are the basic stuff. These are the basic stuff and the foundational pieces that most podcasters totally ignore. And then they wonder why their shows aren't growing or why their podcast isn't monetized or why they're not getting an ROI. Is because they're missing these key foundational pieces. Once you have this stuff in place and you have an alignment between everything that you do on the show, you're going to attract the right listeners. And when you attract the right listeners, monetization becomes far more easier. Getting an ROI becomes so much easier. Growing becomes so much easier. So please go through this video again if you need to, and then think about how does it relate to you? What can you do? What changes can you make? Because every single podcast is slightly different, but that's what we provide, again, personalized guidance along the way. And I'm hoping these videos can aid you on your journey to growing fast, getting big, and monetizing as soon as possible, turning your slow growth podcast into a positive ROI show as soon as possible. And if you want to learn more about what we do, there's a link down below. It's going to pitch you. That whole point is to get you on a little discovery call with our team to help you intimately. But again, if you're interested, we break down our entire process of helping podcasters grow. And if not, subscribe to this YouTube channel. We're building the #1 education company out there for podcasting entrepreneurs. If that's you, you want to subscribe. And with that being said, peace.